Turn with me to Hebrews chapter 7 today. Now, I'm going to be honest. Hebrews is a tough book to get through. The language of Hebrews is tough. If you read it and you think, wow, this would be easier if I was Hebrews, then you're kind of maybe getting a little bit of, I think, the point. I do believe that this book was written to people who were steeped in the Jewish culture, and therefore, if you're not Jewish by culture, it's a little extra homework. It's a little harder to get. It refers to things that that maybe were understood by its audience, but maybe we have to do a little extra homework for. That's okay. I'm a big believer that if you got to work for it, it's worth it, and you'll learn it better. There's a lot in Hebrews about the Old Testament law, and if you're not raised under that, that can be a very foreign world to us. And understandably so, it probably should be, because we are a New Testament church. We are saved by grace. The New Testament reminds us again and again that we don't have to be Jewish to be saved. We don't have to follow all of the Old Testament laws. But to get the book of Hebrews, you kind of got to put yourself back in that place long enough to get what the writer is talking about, and then still pull back out and see where he or she is going with it. And that means we got to do all that in about a half hour, which is where the struggle is. As my father, also a preacher, points out, the problem with Sunday morning preaching is if you bring up a big subject and you take the lid off the can, you got to get the lid back on in a half hour. And that's not always easy with some of these bigger books. And Hebrews is not a short book. We'll do our best with that today. If we want to understand this book, we've got to do that. We've got to kind of put ourselves back in this Old Testament mindset to get to where the writer is telling us how we apply the Old Testament to our New Testament lives. Do we need to understand this book? Well, yeah, absolutely. It's part of the New Testament. It's God's Word, and there's really powerfully good stuff in here. I think it's a really powerful book. Today, we talk about Melchizedek. And that's one of those subjects that's both, because of its littleness, it's a big deal. It's a big deal to the book of Hebrews. Who is this guy? Well, before we get into Hebrews, I actually want to go back to Genesis to talk about who he is. So, Genesis chapter 14, verse 17. After Abram returned, this is before Abram even gets renamed Abraham. After Abram returned from defeating Chedorlaomer and the kings allied with him, the king of Sodom came out to meet him in the valley of Shaveh, that is the king's valley. Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, and this would be the city that will one day be renamed Jerusalem, but currently it's still just Salem. Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High, and he blessed Abram, saying, "Blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand." And then Abram gave him a tenth of everything. Just in those four verses, one of which doesn't even talk about Melchizedek, we've got a fair amount going on. Melchizedek is king of Salem, but he's also priest of God. Now, there's no this is Abraham. We're in Genesis 14. We're in the beginning. There's no Israelite nation yet. He is a priest of God. He's not a priest of a false god, of a pagan god. Abraham, this is the first time we read about tithing. Abraham takes a tenth of the plunder, gives it to Melchizedek. But there's a lot packed into those three verses about Melchizedek. But there's a lot that's not packed in there, and there's a lot of questions that we may have. All right, so we're going to fast forward. Is that all we've got on Melchizedek? Almost. Psalm chapter 110. It's not a long chapter, so we're just going to read all of Psalm chapter 110. The Lord says to my Lord, Sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. The Lord will extend your mighty scepter from Zion. You will rule in the midst of your enemies. Your troops will be willing on your day of battle. Arrayed in holy majesty from the womb of the dawn, you will receive the dew of your youth. The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. The Lord is at your right hand. He will crush kings on the day of his wrath. He will judge the nations, heaping up the dead and crushing the rulers of the whole earth. He will drink from a brook beside the way. Therefore he will lift up his head. And that's it. 4 verses in the Old Testament about Melchizedek. And one of those 4, 3 of those 4 are in Genesis. And then we got one reference to him in Psalm, and then we're done. Nothing else on him, yet apparently a big deal. Psalm says someone will be a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. But this will, if it seems like setting up the bigger picture, it is. Hebrews gets to that. I like foreshadowing. I like good books that have good foreshadowing. There's nothing better than when it's pulled off perfectly, and this is pulled off perfectly. Genesis sets it up, Psalm kicks it down the road, and then Hebrews swoops in and says this is where it sees its fulfillment. The writer of Hebrews will tell us why this is a big deal, why God was setting this up. So let's answer the question of why is Melchizedek a big deal? Now we're in Hebrews chapter 7, and starting with verse 11. If perfection could have been attained through the Levitical priesthood, for on the basis of it the law was given to the people, why was there still need for another priest to come, one in the order of Melchizedek, not in the order of Aaron? For when there is a change of the priesthood, there must also be a change of the law. He of whom these things are said belonged to a different tribe, and no one from that tribe has ever served at the altar. For it is clear that our Lord being Jesus, descended from Judah. And in regard to that tribe, Moses said nothing about priests. And what we have said is even more clear if another priest like Melchizedek appears, one who has become a priest not on the basis of a regulation as to his ancestry, but on the basis of the power of an indestructible life. For it is declared you are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. The former regulation is set aside because it was weak and useless, for the law made nothing perfect, and a better hope is introduced by which we draw near to God. Okay, so why do we care about this Melchizedek guy? What on earth does he matter to us in the church of the 21st century? The law will never produce goodness, only legalness. This is important to get for Old Testament law. This is important to get for our laws today. We'll talk more on that in a minute. It is only in choosing the right thing that we get the right result. Laws don't do that. The laws don't make you a good person. They make you legal. They don't necessarily make you good. An example of this, if you pay your taxes, always, great, you're legal. You're not in trouble with the law. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't give to charity. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't do good things for other people. You can be the most legal person in the world, never get a speeding ticket, never get all your, never have a late fee with any of your bills or anything like that. You could never be in a lick of trouble. That doesn't make you good, does it? That doesn't mean that you've given to charity. That doesn't mean that you've helped the poor. That doesn't mean that you've helped people in need. Legalness and goodness are different. And there's a problem if we begin to equate the two. We live in a world where we have some people that are convinced that the world will become a better place if we regulate it there. That if we just get the right rules on the books and the right laws in the books, that it will become a utopia. I think I said a week or two ago that I am increasingly getting into dystopian fiction. There used to be utopian fiction. Utopia was the idea, science fiction idea. Star Trek is utopian fiction. If we just get enough technology, we can make all the problems of the world go away. That was Gene Roddenberry's goal with Star Trek. If we just get enough, and I like that view. Wouldn't it be nice if we get to an enlightened point where racism is gone and we get to all these other things? Star Trek is this utopian future. In fact, Gene Roddenberry had a rule about writing Star Trek: the crew can't fight with each other. Everybody gets along. The writers hated that because it was hard to make good fiction with that. And as soon as Gene Roddenberry passed away, they came out with Deep Space Nine, which was their third Star Trek show, and now everybody fought because Gene Roddenberry was dead and they were allowed to do that now. But in the old Star Trek and in the Next Generation, nobody fought because that was his rule. In a utopian future, everybody gets along. I like that. I liked Deep Space Nine better, which was a little more dystopian. I like Fahrenheit 451 in 1984 and Animal Farm and these others that were more dystopian in predicting, I think more accurately, that you can't legalize and regulate your way to perfection. In fact, if anything, the more rules you have, the more people are going to rebel against it, the more people are going to fight against that. And I think we're seeing that play out. The more rules you put on people, the more room you have for people to be lawbreakers. If you overregulate everything, you're just going to get more chances for breaking the law. You're not going to make everybody better by giving them more laws that they have to follow. You're just going to set up that they're going to break all these extra rules. There's going to be too much to remember. Too many laws, and everybody is a lawbreaker. I knew a police officer who was told when he became a police officer, if you follow somebody for, I don't remember what the number was, 6 blocks, 8 blocks, and you can't figure out what they're doing wrong and an excuse to pull them over, you're not doing your job. We've got enough laws on the books that you should be able to pull somebody over within 6 or 8 blocks. They don't get their turn signal on in time. They're driving too fast or too slow. There was a police officer in a town that I lived in who saw a guy driving by and he had a squirrel taped to a windshield wiper that was going. And he thought, I know that's got to be illegal, but I can't figure out what the law is. And eventually he pulled him over and for illegal possession of a squirrel, which I gather is not a law. And he just kind of made it up on the spot. And most of us couldn't figure out why cruelty to animals wasn't called into play on that one, or something that actually exists. But he was frustrated that after a number of blocks, that was all he could come up with. There's a reason. Once I heard that this police officer was told within 6 or 8 blocks you should be able to find them doing something wrong, since that day, if there is a police officer behind me, I'm just in instant panic mode. They may not be after me, but that didn't make me, hearing that rule didn't make me a better driver. It just elevated my heart rate constantly. I will say this one, because I'm still mad about this all these years later. In Tuscola, Illinois, I left a party with some friends, and a cop pulled me over for weaving in my lane, which, as far as I'm concerned, is code for you were driving perfectly fine. We just couldn't figure out what to get you for. You never crossed the lane. Kept trying to get me to admit that I was drinking. There was no alcohol there at all. Eventually, I said, can I have the breath test? Because I haven't been drinking. And then he let me go. It didn't make me a better driver from that point on. It just made me a more terrified, paranoid driver that they can pull me over for weaving in my lane, which, now you're just trying to be nitpicky, I feel, at this point. Lots of regulations just create more chances to break those regulations, but I don't think it makes us better people. Sorry to those in here who have legal backgrounds. There is a reason why there are a lot of lawyer equals snake jokes. Because we as a culture get that you can be legal and not be good. And those jokes are the source of that. And I think recent politics have shown that we have some lawyers out there that are legal but not necessarily good. I think we get that in 2020. We know that you can be an expert in the law and be perfectly legal and still be a snake. So surely by now we recognize that legal isn't always good. In fact, legal may be bad. There may be some bad laws on the books. It takes something more to make us a good person. The Bible's goal is to perfect us. Perfection comes through Jesus. In the Old Testament, what we read about specifically is that year after year, the Levites offered sacrifices for the people. And year after year, sin was kicked down, the can was kicked down the road. It was rolled back, but it wasn't gotten rid of. A sacrifice might make you right with God until the next sin. What we read is that we ask the question, what takes away sin? And the answer in the Old Testament was nothing. That we can put it off. You can get rid of that sin, but future sins are going to require future sacrifices. You will never be freed from its power entirely. You can't be cleansed from its stain. You can be forgiven for this time, but future sins will still be counted against you. All those laws, all those regulations in the Old Testament, all those animals died to kick the can down the road. Eventually, and I believe that the purpose of the Old Testament was to have people asking, wouldn't it be nice if there's a better cure for this? Wouldn't a better fix that can get rid of sin once and for all? Now, Genesis 14, Abraham meets a guy that is a priest of God, not a false God. He's a priest of the true God. He's not Jewish. He's not Hebrew. He is a priest of God. And then you get to Solomon. Solomon says, one day there will be a priest, not like a Levite priest who kicks the can down the road, but a forever priest like Melchizedek who's right with God and in a right relationship with him, and he will be priest forever. We want cured from sin, and the Levitical priesthood couldn't do that. And it was only for Israel anyway. If you were Canaanite, if you were Egyptian, if you were Hittite, you were out of luck. A cure for the world's sin, and Melchizedek wasn't Jewish. He wasn't an Israelite. The Levites were the temp fix for Israel, but Melchizedek wasn't Israel. And he was right with God, and Abraham saw that he was right with God. We need a priest like Melchizedek, one who is greater than the Levitical priesthood, and that's what Jesus is. He is the one who doesn't push it back. He doesn't kick the can down the road. He doesn't roll the sins back for a bit. He gets rid of it once and for all. The Old Testament law was good, but it wasn't complete. It set the stage for the complete. It wasn't meant to last. Jesus is the perfect cure for sin. And so we keep reading in Hebrews chapter 7, verse 20. And it was not without an oath. Others became priests without any oath. But he became a priest with an oath when God said to him, "The Lord has sworn, and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever." Because of this oath, Jesus has become the guarantee of a better covenant. Now, there have been many of those priests since death prevented them from continuing in office. But because Jesus lives forever, he has a permanent priesthood. Therefore, he is able to save completely those who come to God through him, because he always lives to intercede for them. The covenant under Jesus, our new covenant, it was perfect. It's also permanent. Do you know what the job of a priest is? Again, we don't have this today. So we have to put ourselves back in that mindset. Do you know what the job of a king we get? There's still some kings around the world. Kings ruled. They were in charge. They set the laws back then. What does a priest do? The priest, and it's not, and I think what throws us off is, in a day and age when we have Catholic priests, they're not the same thing as what we talk about when we talk about Old Testament priests. The priest was the middleman who stood in the gap between men and God. God is holy. We're not. And that holiness made him unapproachable. But the priests were allowed to represent the people for God. Kind of like I think as Americans, we get the concept of middlemen really well. I have an insurance salesman. I have an insurance agent, and I go through my insurance agent so that I don't have to deal with the company. That's their job. I don't want to deal with the insurance company and all those little loopholes and laws, and I want them to deal with it. You send me my bill, tell me what needs fixing in my policy, you do that work, you be the middleman. I think we get that. Salesmen, spokesmen, congressmen. Our whole country is based upon the concept of, I don't want to have to vote on laws. I vote for somebody to vote for the laws, to make those decisions. Our whole government is based on the concept of a middleman. So, skip back with me now to the beginning of Hebrews chapter 7. We're just stay in the same chapter. Go back with me to verse 1. This Melchizedek was king of Salem and priest of God Most High. He met Abraham returning from the defeat of the kings and blessed him. And Abraham gave him a tenth of everything. First, his name means king of righteousness. Literally, that's what Melchizedek means. Then also, king of Salem means king of peace, because Salem, shalom, means peace. Without father or mother, without genealogy, without beginning of days or end of life, like the Son of God, he remains a priest forever. And what that reference is to, we've read all the verses about Melchizedek. We don't know anything about his mom or dad. We don't know when he died. He's just this mysterious figure that comes on the scene, and then he's gone. Like he's immortal, but Jesus is immortal. Verse 4. Just think how great he was. Even the patriarch, Abraham, gave him a tenth of the plunder. Jesus is compared to Melchizedek. And one of those comparisons is that he is an eternal priest forever. We don't know where the beginning or the end of Melchizedek is. I don't think the writer of Hebrews is trying to say that he existed before. In fact, I know the writer of Hebrews is not saying that he existed before time, that he never died. It's not what the writer is saying. But because we don't have a beginning and an ending to him in the story, the comparison is Jesus. It was God on earth. Jesus is immortal. He existed before his virgin birth, and he is king and priest forever. Like Melchizedek's story has no beginning and end. And now, think back with me to the Old Testament. Judges, I love the book of Judges. The book of Kings, and there are priests and there are prophets in there. And Israel kept going. Judges is such a repetitive book. Every chapter seems to begin with the phrase, and again the Israelites did evil in the eyes of God. And God delivered them into the hands of, insert tribe for this chapter. And they oppressed them, and Israel cried out to God, and God raised up for them the deliverer, insert the judge of that chapter. And every chapter in Judges is the same. We call that the cycle of apostasy, that they just kept failing, and somebody had to come along and save them, and then they would follow God as long as that judge lived. And then that judge would die, and then they would fall back into apostasy, and they would just do this again and again, and it was this cycle of apostasy. And frankly, we see this in the nation of Judah. They had good kings, and when they had good kings, the nation did okay at following God, and when they had bad kings, the nation did not do okay following God generally. They had good priests and bad priests. It was not a stable situation. If only there was a good priest that the people could keep, that wouldn't die off, that was good and worth following. And I'm reading a book right now called The Vengeance of Rome, which is about a guy that it's set in the 1930s, and this guy ends up in Italy, and he's completely enraptured by Benito Mussolini and falls into it. And the writer's point is that he wanted to explore, how do people fall for this stuff? And so the main character is frustrated with elections because sometimes bad people get elected. If only we had a good tyrant who I trust. And I know it seems laughable, but that's the line of reasoning. People fell in behind Mussolini and Hitler and other tyrants because if we can just put all our faith in one person and trust this guy to always make the right decisions, then wouldn't it be great if we didn't have to keep electing people who may be good or may be bad? Now, obviously, we know, I would hope that we know, I don't think that we have learned our lesson entirely, but wouldn't it be nice if we learned the lesson that all people are imperfect on earth, and they will always let you down at some point, and they will always make mistakes at some point. I'm reminded last night I read that this character shows up at a meeting, and a poster says, Mussolini is always right, which is laughable to me in the year 2020, but people fall for that. But there is one person who is always right. Jesus is always right. Wouldn't it be great if there was a perfect person who could be priest forever and is always right and is always perfect? And that's the point of Hebrews. There is that one. We don't have to worry about good priests dying and bad priests taking over. You don't have to worry about good kings or bad kings, or if is the judge always watching us. And we'll follow God when our judge is with us, but when the judge dies off, we won't anymore. Wouldn't it be great, says the writer of Hebrews, if you had an eternal Melchizedek, someone who was always right with God, to represent the people before God? And the writer of Hebrews says that's who Jesus is. Jesus saves us forever as our priest. There's no replacing him, and there's no worry about him being corrupted because he is perfect. So the big question here, Genesis chapter 14. Why did Abraham even offer sacrifices to Melchizedek? Why did he tithe? There's no rule in chapters 1 through 13 about tithing. Why does he do this? Even Abraham didn't have the right to go before God. Abraham saw Melchizedek and said, wow, I need to offer sacrifices through this guy to God, because even Abraham recognized in his sin that he didn't have that right to stand before the throne of God. Even the Levites could only enter into the Holy of Holies in the temple once a year, one guy. Very poetic, not the best of systems. It was the system that God set up, but who would want to live under that forever? The Levites were, this is a bold statement, but I think it's what the writer of Hebrews is saying. The Levites were not as good of a system as it was under Melchizedek. Melchizedek was a foreshadowing of Jesus. He was a king and priest like Jesus. Saul was the king. Saul thought he could offer the sacrifices, did the job of the priest, lost the kingship over it. That was the deal breaker for God. You are not king and priest. You are just the king. How dare you do this? I will give the kingdom to somebody else. But Melchizedek was king and priest, like Jesus. In some ways, the Levitical priesthood was a step back from God. It showcased the division between man and God. It was necessary to learn about God's holiness. It was necessary to learn how far sin separates us from God. And it sets up the fact that Jesus, like Melchizedek, then is the step back to what it should be. There was a Melchizedek priesthood, then there wasn't, then there is again. And the writer of Hebrews says that's the better system. Just like we were made to be right with God, and then in Genesis chapter 3, we're not right with God, Adam and Eve on behalf of all humanity, and then we are right with God again. That's why we say we get to go back to God. God made us to live in harmony with him, and he wants us back. Sin separated us, but that implies that we were right with him at one time as a race, as the human race, and we get to go back again. Jesus' sacrifice never loses its power or its efficacy. His blood saves us just as much now as it ever has. God promises us that Jesus is our one and only way to the Father. John chapter 14, verse 6. I am the way and the truth and the life, and nobody gets to the Father except through me. He was prophesied about in the Old Testament. He was promised, and it was promised in the New Testament, that he is the only way to get right with God. There is no other. Sacrifices year after year under a changing priesthood taught a lesson that we don't want to keep going that way. We need something better. And Jesus is better. One sacrifice, once and for all, forever our priest to bring us to God. Now, we can always approach God, the writer of Hebrews says. We can always go before his throne with our prayers, because Jesus is seated there and lets us come in. He is our advocate, and he invites us into the throne room. He has paved that way. So, Hebrews chapter 7, let's finish up the chapter, verse 26. Such a high priest meets our need, one who is holy, blameless, pure, set apart from sinners, exalted above the heavens. Unlike the other high priests, he does not need to offer sacrifices day after day, first for his own sins, then for the sins of the people. He sacrificed for their sins once for all when he offered himself. For the law appoints as high priests men who are weak, but the oath, which came after the law, appointed the Son who has been made perfect forever. The point, and I do think we want to read the very beginning of chapter 8, the point of what we're saying is this. We do have such a high priest who sat down at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven, and who serves in the sanctuary, the true tabernacle, set up by the Lord, not by man. Why is Melchizedek better than the Levites? Well, under the Levites, I go back to this. Under the Levites, you were never in a right relationship, in a personal relationship with God. You could be legal with God. You could be right with God, but it wasn't the purpose of the Levites to put you in a personal relationship with God. The best you could hope for was to be legally right with God for a while, until you broke his law again. You always had to offer sacrifices to God to get legal with God again and again. Abraham recognized that Melchizedek had a personal relationship with God, a right relationship with him. And another thing was that the Levites were, of course, imperfect. They were human. Of course they were. They were people, but Jesus is immortal and incorruptible. The new covenant is Jesus. Jesus didn't bring it, he is it. Jesus is the new covenant. Abraham brought a covenant to the people. He introduced the law to the people, but Jesus is the covenant. The Old Testament law was impersonal. I'm not saying that God didn't love the people and the people didn't love him, but it was a distant relationship. It was more impersonal because the people had to go through the priests to get to God. There was an impersonality to it, and that was on purpose. That was God's design. Laws typically are impersonal. I like the writer Victor Hugo. Victor Hugo's famous book, Les Miserables. One of these days I'll read it. I've watched it. I've seen it live, but I haven't actually sat down to read the book. But the story, of course, of Les Miserables, Jean Valjean steals some bread to feed for food, to feed his family, and the law doesn't care. Javert, the cop, chases him down for the whole book because he broke the law. The fact that it was for the kids to feed people wasn't the point to Javert. The law is the law. The law is always right. Again, the law may not be good. The law is right. The law is legal. If you're starving, should you steal stuff? That's the dilemma that Victor Hugo writes up. And I think Hugo does a very good job talking about the difference between legalness and goodness. There's no question that Jean Valjean is the hero of the book, but he commits crimes. But he's a good man. Javert is the villain of the book, but he's the cop. He's legal. And I think Hugo does a very good job giving us that dichotomy between legalness and goodness. One of the things, and here's where I leave my notes behind as I think of this. One of the problems that I think that our culture has today is that when you take God, our original founding fathers, like George Washington, good Christian man, said that our country would hold together when we stayed biblically based. Our founding fathers only set up to create laws. They didn't set out to create morality. They expected you to look to the Bible for morality. And so our country was founded on go to the Bible for what is right and for what is good and evil. Our laws are for what is legal or illegal. Now that God has by and large left our culture, we have a culture that's looking to our laws for both what is legal and illegal and for what is right and wrong, for what is good and evil. And that's our problem in 2020. And it's why everybody is so crazy politically right now, is because we're trying to legislate good and evil. And so people are really, this is why people are so wild up on politics. They're not fighting for legal or illegal. They're fighting for right and wrong, good and evil. You can't legislate good and evil. The government can't do that because we can keep voting. We can vote things in and out. We can vote that this is legal and therefore good, and then we can change the laws. And that's why people are freaking out about politics these days, because they think we're changing what is good and evil. The Christian says this tells us what is good and evil. The government just tells us what is legal or illegal, but this is good and evil. Hopefully Christians don't freak out so much about politics, because we're not looking to politics to tell us what is right and wrong. We're just looking to politics for what are the laws. In the Old Testament, the law brought you to God, and it was good, but it wasn't that personal. But God sent Jesus to us so that we could do more than be saved from sin. We can be saved to God. God could have saved us by a set of rules, but he didn't want that. He wanted to save us in love through Jesus, by his Son. Why? Because the reason he saves us is the personal reason. It's because he is a God of love, and because he loves us, he offers us a personal relationship with him through his Son, Jesus. The law was a tool to bring you to God, but Jesus is more than just a tool for us. He is the point. He is the one that we are saved to. He loves us and he saves us. Our high priest loves us and wants a relationship with us. He is not someone to be feared in your rearview mirror. He loves you. He has a relationship with you. I want my daughter to respect my rules, but I definitely want her to love me as well. And I want her to not fear me, even when she's in trouble. I still want that relationship of love to always be there. Sometimes we sin, sometimes we don't do the right thing. But God, I pray that we always know that even when we sin, God loves us and loves us through his Son, Jesus. Do you, in turn, love God? Because heaven is going to be a long time to spend with somebody that you don't love. Our salvation is not a castle in the clouds with harps and wings and halo and glitter. Our salvation is an eternity with the one who loves us more than anyone ever has or ever will, and it's to someone who is more lovable than anyone that you will ever meet. The point is that our salvation is about God, not about eternity. It's not about us. It's about him. It is personal, and it's meaningless without the love of God. Salvation without the love of God is a meaningless concept. I hope that we get that. Our hymn of invitation today is hymn number 332. Are you saved to God through Jesus? That's the question. That's the point of this all. If you would like to talk about that, I would like to talk with you about that after church and what that looks like.